We briefly considered the world of the New Testament, the theological, the philosophical context, and the different chronological events, the different historical events that gave rise to the period of the New Testament canon. And we now move to considering the Gospels, biographies of Jesus. I'm excited to be able to go over this lecture material with you today. And before I do that, though, let's talk about Jesus outside of the New Testament. So, have you ever wondered whether Jesus was mentioned outside of the New Testament canon? Man, that's a great question to ask. And the answer is yes, he is on multiple occasions referenced by non Christian authors. So the first you can see here is Josephus. He's a noteworthy Jewish historian, and he refers to Jesus in two of his works. You have the Roman historian Tacitus, and you can see both of them are they lived the generation after Jesus, and Tacitus also refers to Jesus in his Annals when detailing Nero's fire in Rome. You can see the Roman historian Suetonius. He refers to Jesus in a report explaining why Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome, which is actually, I think, referenced in the book of Acts as well. And then you also have the philosopher Maro ben Serapion, and he refers to the death of Jesus in a letter to his son. And so I think we have the Gospels as these biographical accounts, which we'll talk about here in a second. But the fact that non-Christians are aware of Jesus and at bare minimum his followers, I think that emphasizes, it demonstrates that Jesus wasn't just this I don't know, insignificant figure who gave rise to an insignificant movement. There's clearly something important about this, and at bare minimum, it demonstrates. So, like, Jesus, uh, more and more than likely, was a real person, right? So these are just some references outside of the New Testament to Jesus. And this is worth talking about as well before we dive in. What about these lost gospels? So these are significant. They've gained um, notoriety in the public eye. And in 1945, archaeologists discovered the Nag Hammadi codices. And these were discovered, these codices, and we talked a little bit about codex, I believe, in week one, but these big works of literature. And they were discovered in Egypt, I believe, in a trash dump, which is, that's just kind of interesting historical archaeological discovery. And they included multiple works, but at bare minimum, the two I would say that many people know are the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Peter. Now, we don't have time to delve deeply into these resources. It's not really my great interest for what we're doing here, but it is worth mentioning that we discussed in the first week the criteria for canon. And one of those criterion were, okay, it had to be, for something to be considered canonical, it had to be written within a certain time period by a certain person. And both of these gospels don't fall under that criteria. They're written much later, and they're not written by apostles. So because of that, that's why we don't include them in the canon. That's why they're not considered apostolic sources. We don't consider them as scripture. They're written much later by different people, and the church knew this from the outset. So, all right, let's go ahead and keep moving now as we move to the Gospels. So, recall this order we considered at the very beginning. What is the Bible? And we can see here we have moved into the New Testament. And the first literature we encounter in the New Testament are the Gospels, the four Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we'll also consider the Acts of the Apostles as well. But you can see here, this is why we're covering Gospels and then Acts, and that is because of just the order of the New Testament, and it makes sense why Gospels are first. Well, because they're about Jesus, right? And our faith is ultimately founded and rooted in Jesus, the Messiah. So let's go ahead and dive into a little bit more overview on these Gospels. So, all right, just kind of big picture. What are the Gospels in terms of genre? What's the difference between the word gospel and Gospels? A little bit about the authors. Let's consider this for a second. So first, genre. What are the Gospels? Well, the Gospels are akin to Greco-Roman biographies. All right? So fundamentally, the Gospels are about somebody, and they're about Jesus, right? But how do they provide an account? Well, they provide a theological and historical account of Jesus. So, what does it mean that they are theological? Well, in one way, they connect the events of Jesus' life to the Old Testament, and even bigger, they connect Jesus' coming to God's cosmic plan. So, Jesus is not just some random guy who comes. They don't try to explain Jesus' life in purely materialistic terms. They interpret Jesus' life, his teaching, his works, etc., through the bigger lens of God and what God has come to do. And related to that, they're also historical. So the Gospels are explaining real things that really happened in real time. This is really important because you'll find people who even say they're Christians and they'll talk about the resurrection of Jesus in purely spiritual terms. And does the resurrection have a spiritual uh, is it does it have a spiritual implication? Of course it does. But the gospel writers present Jesus as a historical person doing historical things. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. So, second point here. So, the gospel, lowercase g, means good news. It is a proclamation that something awesome has occurred. And that is the heart of the Christian faith, right? Paul says in Romans 1:16 through 17, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. And why is he not ashamed of the gospel? Because it is through the gospel that people are saved. It's this message of good news. The Gospels, capital G, refer to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And those are biographies of Jesus. Now, capital G Gospels include Jesus's lowercase g good news, right? But there's a big difference, and we want to just rightly distinguish between those two things. Gospel, lowercase g, means good news. Capital G Gospels are the four. All right, going a little bit deeper, right? There's a lot of information. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, those are the first three Gospels in that order. They're called the Synoptic Gospels because of their style. Synoptic means to see together. If you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, anybody would notice they're very similar. While John, although he's talking about the same person and same theological perspective, his gospel account is just different. It just has a different flair to it if you read it, right? Different emphases, different events, etc. Now, two of the Gospels are written by eyewitnesses of Jesus' life, Matthew and John. They were disciples of Jesus. So they witnessed everything. Two of the Gospels, the two in the middle, Mark and Luke, they were not eyewitnesses, but they were associates of eyewitnesses. So historically, Mark's account is based on the witness of Peter. And Luke, if you read the beginning of Luke, he goes and he does his own historical investigation, though he's close friends with Paul, so he probably would have learned events from Paul too. Three, very last point of the gospel writers, were Jewish, while Luke was a Gentile, right? He was a non-Jew, and he is an associate of Paul. If you read the book of Acts, and we'll talk about this a little bit when we consider the Gospel of Luke, but Luke was a doctor who befriended Paul and joined him on his missionary journey. A lot here. So let's go ahead and we'll keep moving on here. So, all right. So that's kind of bare bones, like overview of authorship, things like that. Let's just think about some of the bare content here within the Gospels, right? And how do we distill all of the Gospels down to a few points? But this is just a good place for us to start. So, while each Gospel has its own biographical distinctions, together the Gospels declare, big picture, God is triune. There is a God, and he exists eternally as three persons, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And they are three distinct persons, and we'll consider Jesus' baptism here in just a second. But the Bible is robustly Trinitarian in that regard. Also, the gospel writers unequivocally present Jesus as God. Jesus is worshipped, Jesus forgives sins, which is something only God does, and Jesus claims equality with God. John 5:17-18. My Father is working until now, and I am working. This is why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus calls God his Father in every single gospel. And John tells us here that the Jews understood this to be a claim to divinity and equality with God. So, unquestionably, the gospel writers present Jesus as God. And related to that, the gospel writers present Jesus as the fulfillment of the Old Testament's promises. Jesus is the Messiah, the Christ. We'll talk a little bit about what that means, who came to save sinners. We've talked about this a little bit as we've considered the Old Testament. Proto-evangelium, suffering servant, new David, Son of Man, Jesus. So Jesus is the climax, the fulfillment. He brings together all of these hopes of the Old Testament in himself. And the gospel writers are very clear about this, and it is glorious. All right, let's move to just an overview of the synoptics, and then we'll consider the Gospel of Matthew. So first, again, the synoptics are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they share a robust commonality. Here's a pie chart. I'm not the biggest pie chart fan, but hopefully this helps you to just kind of get a picture here. So Mark is by far the shortest. Luke and Matthew, similar length, although Matthew, at least chapter-wise, is 28 chapters and Luke is 24 chapters. But you can see here the overlap between these three gospel accounts. Some of the material is unique to them. Some of them share material with each other, and all three of them then occasionally share material with the other. It's extraordinary. And let me give you an example of this. So I told you we would talk a little bit about the baptism of Jesus, but I'm going to let you go ahead and look at this as I drink from my gigantic water bottle that my dad got for me at Whole Foods. I told you it was gigantic. So, all right. This is a great example. So, again, the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic means to see together. So, though there's great similarity between the three, the synoptics uniquely record and situate events. All right, so here, look at the Gospel of Matthew. This is Jesus' baptism. You can see here, compared to the other two, Matthew's presentation of this event is much longer. And you can see here, especially in verse 15, like Matthew records Jesus's words in verse 15. Let it be so now, so why be baptized? And Jesus says, for thus it is fitting to fulfill all righteousness. And all three accounts are going to record then the Father's words from heaven. They're all going to record the Spirit descending like a dove. But Matthew records Jesus' words regarding the fulfillment of all righteousness. So this is significant. All three record the same event. And within that event, Matthew adds additional details about the event. Namely, Jesus' words about why he is baptized. This helps us to understand what Matthew is doing in his gospel, right? He's emphasizing how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. And it's not that Mark and Luke aren't doing that. It's just Matthew's really driving that home within this event. Again, these are theological and historical biographies. Now here's another interesting detail within this. You can see here I have these ... and then something after that. So in Matthew and Mark, after Jesus' baptism, the temptation of Jesus is the next thing. But in the Gospel of Luke, you have Jesus' baptism, and then you have his genealogy. So, this helps us to understand what they're doing, and also just the type of biographies they are. Matthew and Mark tie the baptism to the temptation narrative, while Luke immediately jumps into the genealogy of Jesus to emphasize his eternal sonship. It's beautiful. So they each have their similarities, right? Same events, but within those events, they emphasize certain aspects of it and then situate them in a certain area within their gospels. Absolutely remarkable. And so, with that, let's go ahead and dive now into the first of the gospels, Matthew.